Dirty Moderates, we know many of you are avid readers of the Old Gray Lady, as she used to be called, the New York Times. And we have had some Timesians on the show. And today I am really pleased to welcome New York Times columnist David French to the program. For those that don't know David, in case you've been living under a rock and not reading your Times, David is an expert on law, faith, and politics. Prior to his being at the Times, if you're a political geek like me, you knew him from the Dispatch. He was a contributing writer of The Atlantic. You may have read him there. Prior to that, he wrote for National Review from about 4 or 5 years back in 2015. He also spent the bulk of his career as a practicing lawyer with an emphasis on the First Amendment and all the free speech absolutists among us love that. And he also took time off from that career, actually, the Renaissance man that he is, to join the Army in his 30s and serve in Iraq as a JAG, otherwise known as a Judge Advocate General. David, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
All right. So I wanted to start with your recent column on Christian nationalism, because I think it's, the ever-changing, ever shape-shifting discussion, but it always yet feel the same way to me. And here's what I mean. I was very, very young when the religious right, as it once were, came into politics. But I specifically remember the Ralph Reed era, in the early 90s and mid 90s, and Ralph Reed, all of the sort of values coalition, which was kind of the anti-Bill Clinton amen corner, you might call them, back in the day, and now we're at a place where the Republican Party, though there are people who claim to be devoted to Christian values, have continued to back a guy who is completely and morally and ethically unfit in every way. But he gave them Roe. He does more than wink and nod at them. Ronald Reagan, who also never went to church, didn't do a lot of the social conservative stuff that arguably Trump was able to accomplish, for better or worse. But I wanted, in your recent column, it's very important because you're also a First Amendment guy, to sort of unpack this in a First Amendment way, Establishment Clause, et cetera, et cetera. So allow me to just begin by reading a piece of it.
Sure.
All right. You write, the problem with Christian nationalism isn't with Christian participation in politics, but rather the belief that there should be Christian primacy in politics and law. It can manifest itself through ideology, identity, and emotion. And if it were to take hold, it would both upend our Constitution and fracture our society. So I just wanted to start there, because I think, by way of a long intro, I think there are many, many people on the right, or on the Christian right, who do believe in Christian primacy. But I also think on the left, and I have lots of issues with the left, they sort of forget that there is a freedom of religion in this country.
Right.
And religious values do matter, and a First Amendment doesn't mean religion is banished. It just means it can't be an all-enforcing mechanism. Can you kind of dive into your thoughts on Christian nationalism and work outward?
Yeah, I wrote that column because there was a movie coming up called God and Country. It's produced by Rob Reiner, directed by Dan Partland, and it's taking on Christian nationalism. I was interviewed for the film, and a whole lot of people on the Christian right got really mad at me for being in that film, because they said, you're airing the dirty laundry of the church in a non-Christian environment and things like this. And I thought, wait a minute. Okay, we all of us, not just Christians, have an interest in figuring out religion and politics. We all have an interest in knowing what are the limits, for example, of bringing religious authority into politics. What are the limits of trying to exclude religion from politics? So what I tried to draw a distinction between was, every one of us brings our values into the public square. Every one of us, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, doesn't matter. Atheist, doesn't matter. We all have a worldview. We all have a set of values that informs our politics. And we should welcome people bringing their values into the public square. Bring in your values, argue for your values. And if you think that religious values should be treated somehow differently or worse, well, how do you feel about the abolition movement, for example? Heavily religious. Civil rights movement, heavily religious. Martin Luther King was a Baptist pastor. So you bringing your religious values into the public square is just part of being a citizen, and we should acknowledge that and welcome that. But there is a big difference between saying, I believe X or Y about a given issue, whether it's abortion or sexuality or civil rights, you name it, and then saying my faith should be the faith of the country as a formal matter, or my fellow members of the church or sort of super citizens who should be elected to public office merely because of their faith identity. Or what's very dangerous from that emotional standpoint that I talked about was this sort of idea that the very fate of the church is linked completely to, or is linked to the fate of politics in this country, which then makes people, and as one of the things that we saw in the run up to January 6th, with this panic that took over parts of the Christian church, that with Donald Trump not protecting them, they were going to be totally exposed to the secular left. And so this idea that the church was going to suffer because Donald Trump wasn't president whipped some people into a frenzy. That's a different thing from saying, as a Christian, I believe in justice for the oppressed, or as a Christian, I believe that people should be entitled to equal treatment under the law. That's bringing your values in. It's different to say, well, I'm a Christian, therefore I'm only going to vote for Christians, or I'm a Christian and my faith should be enshrined as the faith of the United States of America.
Yeah. One of the things that's very interesting is when what was partly the moral majority and the religious right that kind of rose out of the 60s and 70s and the cultural and social changes in America kind of found its footing in Reagan's ascendancy, although Jimmy Carter did bring a lot of them in. Actually, they just turned on him by the time he ran for re-election. It's interesting to see that the evangelical coalition sort of in any way fits into the part of what is the texture, I guess I might say, of MAGA today. And here's what I mean. One thing about MAGA, for all of its menace and its malice, and I believe its disdain for our institutions, Trump and this sort of populism of it doesn't strike me as religious on its face. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, there's a place for it, but the social conservatism which sort of animated the sort of old school traditional Republican, old school, I say, post 1975 Republican Party. There's sort of an uneasy alliance here still, because that's not their what's the word? That's not their bloody chum in the water.
Well, it's really interesting. I would say we often poorly understand what actually truly motivates voters, because they will tell you something and that's not always the truth.
Right.
So,
are you saying Trump is underperforming in the polls? Or no?
I do think at this point in time, Trump is what we're seeing now is Trump is underperforming his polling. That's unusual. Yeah. That's unusual. Previously, Trump has overperformed his polling.
Yeah.
But what we're finding is that if you're someone like me, who I was a Reagan conservative, sure. I was for Mitt Romney.
Yep.
And I grew up in a Republican Party that told itself a story. Now, a lot of people on the left are going to hear this story and they're going to go, that's not right. That's not what Republicans really were. But this is what we told ourselves.
Sure.
What we told ourselves is, look, we're not perfect. You're going to find bad apples in this group. But hey, we are committed to this is a party committed to a particular vision of conservatism, limited government, strong national defense, social conservatism, and also a movement committed to character. And that really rose during the Clinton years. And there were a number of religious statements issued about the importance of character in public officials in the 1990s, signed by leading luminaries of the Christian conservative movement. And so this would be how they would have defined themselves, as we are Reagan conservatives with a commitment to character in public officials. Well, along comes Donald Trump, and he is neither one of those things. Mm-hmm. So he's not a Reagan conservative. He's not, he has zero character. And so then all of a sudden, both of these elements that were supposed to be absolutely vital to the Republican Party are just sort of thrown into the trash. And then people turn to you when you say, wait, why are you throwing character and policy into the trash? And they say, you're a rhino, you're a traitor. What happened to you? And so a lot of what people say they really want when push comes to shove, different priorities emerge. And there's some interesting studies showing that, for example, Christian conservatives who have long said, we are single issue voters on abortion, it actually turns out that immigration matters more to them than even abortion does.
Yeah.
And so, the aggression of Trump on immigration was the tipping point for a lot of people in the primary, say in 2016, when other candidates were absolutely more pro-life. But one of the interesting aspects of all of this is MAGA takes a look at sort of social conservatism pre-Trump and totally minimizes everything that was accomplished from a social conservative standpoint prior to 2016, and acts like nothing ever happened. And then in 2016 to 2020, they talk about the Trump justices as if this was a monumental achievement of Donald Trump, when the reality was it was Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell got rid of the filibuster.
Yeah.
And none of those justices, not one of those three would have made it through a nomination process with the filibuster. Not one of them. And the other Republican presidents all had to deal with the filibuster.
Right. Such an important point. Yeah. And also, of course, Merrick Garland would have had Scalia's seat, and, there's all sorts of things that would have gone on. Right. I mean, had he not blocked it. But I think, I think the thing that I find, and I wanted you to, sort of tease some of this out. I was raised as a secular Jew. Okay. But I was educated. I was fortunate to be able to be sent to a very elite private school, not a boarding school, but in South Florida, that was Presbyterian, owned by Presbyterian Church. And it was a very mainline, I'd say very ecumenical, socially and more religiously diverse. It was probably as Jewish as it was Protestant. And I don't remember everybody's politics. I mean, as I got older, I realized which teachers were Democrats, which were Republicans. I wouldn't have been able to know that then. But there was a sense of a communitarianism that I liked about it. While it was values based, as I said, it was not sectarian, specifically not sectarian. So when people talk about the Christian right, and I want to tie this into your upbringing a little bit, not to categorize you in that way, but in the sense of like the Christian, I mean, there's Methodist, there's Baptist, there's Presbyterian, there's Episcopalian. I mean, all these denominations are so different in their own kind of creedal notions, even if they're devoted to the same overwhelming idea. Can you kind of distill that? Because we say Christian evangelical, is that just born again and Baptist? Because I don't see the sort of garden variety Methodist in this movement. Maybe they are. I think we get a lot of things get too papered over, a little too overgeneralized,
Oh, for sure. I mean, one thing that is important to note is nobody really knows how many evangelicals there are in America. Because,
is that right? Oh, wow.
Right, because there's so many different ways of defining the term.
Right. Okay.
So, for example, if you just go with, do you ask somebody, are you evangelical? Then you get one answer. You get one percentage, maybe 33% of America. Then you ask people, what do you attend church? And if so, which kind of church? And then you take people who are in these traditionally evangelical denominations like Southern Baptist, Presbyterian Church of America, Assemblies of God, the non-denominational evangelical churches, and add all those people together, and you get a different percentage. Then if you ask people, do you believe a certain set of propositions about Christianity? In other words, you ask a theological set of questions and you get a different answer entirely. So the number of evangelicals maybe goes from a low of 6 or 7% of America, or who are the people who agree with the traditional evangelical statements of faith, to the whatever 14 or so percent who belong to traditional evangelical congregations, to the 30 or so percent who say, if you're asked, are you evangelical? And they answer yes. But what you have to understand about a lot of those people, a lot of those folks don't ever go to church. By one measure, an absolute, a majority of evangelicals don't go to church. Self-described evangelicals go to church once a month or less. And so it's a term that we really need to try to define. And the reality is we actually fight all the time over the definition. But the really important political community is that exit poll evangelical. So this is the people, if you're a white voter and you come out of a polling place, you might get asked, are you evangelical or born again? And so this is the community that is the sort of the central constituency of the Republican Party, are the people who are self-described white evangelicals. A lot of them wouldn't know Bible verses if the Bible hit them in the face. They never go to church. Right. And so you actually have this culture right now in the country where you have an awful lot of people who are Christian and they're white and they're Republican. And for them, that means, I'm evangelical. And another community of people who say, no. Evangelical is only if you have these specific kinds of beliefs. But when we talk about politics, we're talking about, by and large, the cohort of white voters who answer yes to that exit poll question of, are you an evangelical?
Oh, wow. That is so fascinating. Oh, and suffice it to say, probably one too many citizens or voters who describe themselves as evangelical mistake right-wing dogma, for lack of a better term, for their Bible verses, right? They seem to locate critical ideas and theories of how they vote on biblical principles, which don't exist. I mean,
A good example of this, my friend Russell Moore, who's the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, talks about how someone came up to a pastor and said, I can't believe you were using liberal talking points in the sermon. And the pastor was confused until he realized that the parishioner was speaking about, he had preached about turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, blessing those who persecute you. These are words from Jesus. These are commands from Jesus, right? And the parishioner was so unfamiliar, even with the Sermon on the Mount, that he thought the quotes from Jesus were liberal talking points. And so you have that kind of problem where you have self-described evangelicals, people who are actually in church, or maybe they attend church occasionally or never attend, but identify as Christian. And they are extremely divorced from the historical teachings of the church. They don't know the historical teachings of the church. Now, the interesting reality about MAGA is things have changed. So in 2016, it was the non-church going evangelicals who were the backbone of Trump support. Right. So, but that has now changed. By 2020, and certainly by now, it is both the non-church going evangelical and the church going evangelical who are with Trump. There is no distinction now anymore between those two communities. I mean, there might be at the margins, but they're both overwhelmingly pro-Trump.
Right. Wow. David, take us back a little bit to your formative years, because I'm always fascinated by what shapes people, of course, do that as an interviewer, but I love what you do in the Times, because I do think you're trying to sort of do the best of the discourse. You sort of pose a question, answer it, you have a point of view, like I do here. I have a definitive point of view, but I like to let people talk. And I think that, democracy depends not only upon our discourse, but upon our disagreement in a respectful manner. And that's obviously one of the many things that I think's been eroded in the Trump years. So let's go back and talk about you, where you were born. Were you born in Arkansas? Is that right?
I was born in Opelika, Alabama. So
Opelika, right, which is near Auburn, right? Isn't that?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. My parents were Auburn students. My dad was in grad school. My mom was an undergrad. And I was born to Auburn students in Opelika, Alabama. And I was raised early childhood, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, but from like first grade on, Kentucky, which means that my entire childhood was spent in the Southeastern Conference. I come by my belief in SEC supremacy, honestly, but and so I was born in the South, raised in the South, and also I was raised in a very fundamentalist church. So as a friend of mine says, we did not put the fun in fundamentalism.
When you say fundamental, if I may interrupt, fundamental, is it Pentecostal? What do you mean by that?
So as a technical matter, so I grew up in the A Cappella Churches of Christ, which is a denomination founded in the Mid-South in the mid-19th century. and it is what's called a restorationist. This is going to be we're getting into the theological weeds here.
No. That's why you're here. One of the reasons. Yeah. I mean, I think you're in. I think it. I want to talk about some of this stuff because I think it helps inform your readers, some of which overlap with our listeners, of the kind of, I think, intelligence and insight you bring to your writing, so that people understand why you're saying things. Because I think it's easy to stereotype somebody as a right-wing Christian and not listen.
So, right. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Right. So I grew up in a church it's called restorationist. And what that means is it's part of a religious movement that believes it has restored the original church from apostasy. Okay. So, and restorationist churches can be quite fundamentalist and legalistic because.
And who are the apostates they're referring to? Who are
well, and when I was growing up, it was everybody except us.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay.
Right. So when I say fundamentalist, I'm not kidding around here. So it is. Yep. It was the church. We were the Church of Christ, period. And I was taught from an early age, not by my parents, but by church leaders, that we were the only Christians. Right. And that not only were we the only Christians, but that if you didn't follow the rules very, 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 very strictly on a day-to-day basis, you were just not a Christian anymore. So it was extremely legalistic, extremely exclusive. And I never bought it. Like, I never agreed with it. I didn't know what I believed fully, but I knew it wasn't that. And so at an early age, when I was still in elementary school, I read the Bible from cover to cover. And I remember thinking after I finished it, I was in 6th grade, that, wait a minute. My friends who are Baptist and Catholic and Orthodox and you name it, there's nothing in scripture here that says they're going to hell. What's going on? Right. What is going on? And so I began questioning a lot of this early in
You're a true textualist.
I was a textualist.
Right.
Yes.
An originalist, but contra the congregation you were in, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so I was very much questioning, but it really wasn't until law school that I encountered what I would say is the difference between evangelicalism and fundamentalism. Okay. And as a matter of sort of Christian theology and history. And the way I would there's a great way to discern the difference between sort of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And it really does center around concepts like openness and humility. Mm-hmm. So Richard Land, who's the former head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission in the Southern Baptist Convention, once said, and I think this is exactly right, fundamentalism is not a theology, it's a psychology.
Oh, interesting. That's
how you can have fundamentalist Muslim organizations that fight each other, fundamentalist Christian organizations fight each other all the time, because there isn't one theology that is fundamentalist, but there is a psychology, and that psychology is of absolute burning certainty and ferocity, and also sort of group identity. And that really marks fundamentalism. It's that certainty, it's that ferocity, it's that group solidarity. And evangelicalism, it's not that they had any lower view of scripture at all, but evangelicals also have a more ecumenical approach to the faith. In other words, for example, this is my best understanding of scripture, but I'm open to your understanding. That would be whereas a fundamentalist would say, this is the reading of scripture and you must be open to me. And that creates a very different culture and a very different dynamic.
Right. Very, very fascinating. So, okay. So then you end up, I know you went to Harvard Law School, and speaking of law school, but why was it at law school that you found this distinction? I mean, in other words, you mentioned you're at law school. How would that, I didn't know that Harvard Law would elucidate that in any way, but I'm interested. Tell me.
Oh yeah. Well, so Harvard Law School was my first encounter with evangelical culture. So I grew up Church of Christ. I went to a Church of Christ college. So my college was Church of Christ. I went to a Church of Christ church. I was part of a Church of Christ youth group. And so literally that was the first time in my life I was part of a Christian community that wasn't exclusively Church of Christ. And in fact, I was not only the only Church of Christ person in the Christian fellowship that I was a part of at the law school, many of them hadn't even heard of it. They didn't even know about the religious sect that I grew up in at all. And so for me, I had two culture shocks at once. I had the culture shock of going from the rural South to a Christian college to Harvard Law School, and that's a different culture. And then I had the religious culture shock of going from a fundamentalist upbringing up to the point I'm 22 years old to then joining an evangelical student group. So I had a religious culture shock. I had an academic culture shock all at once. And the bottom line was it was actually really good for me on all counts, I think.
Yeah. And coming out of college, were you driven naturally toward a more conservative politics? Was that?
Yeah. So I'm a Cold War kid. So
me too. Yeah. And boy, do we miss those days, huh?
I do not miss the day after. Do you remember the
that horrible movie, that TV? Yeah. Oh God, that was the most terrifying. No. I don't miss mutually assured destruction necessarily. It matters with or even the containment. I miss the would-be peacemakers on the world stage. I miss leaders like Ronald Reagan, who stood for something.
Serious people, serious people in politics.
Right.
So I was a Cold War kid in the sense that, so growing up, there were two aspects of sort of my emerging ideology that were clear from the beginning. And one of them was I was pro-life, and the other one was I was anti-communist.
There you go.
And so
I'm with you on the anti-communist stuff.
We'll go with 50-50 for now. But so I was pro-life and I was anti-communist. And in that circumstance, the Reagan really, really appealed to me.
Sure.
And also the older I got, I began to be more and more skeptical of central planning. In other words, the ability of governmental institutions to plan at scale for 330 million citizens. So
I still hold those truths to be self-evident.
Yes,
I do.
And so for me, those three legs were sort of this is my core ideology. And also, again, this is rooted in my Christian faith. I had a strong conviction that we should be led by people of real character, because we can't predict everything that a president is going to face. And so we need somebody who's a serious human being to be able to respond to crises as they emerge. And also, the president is a very important cultural figure. A lot of people look to a president as a role model, especially partisans on the president's team, right? And so I wanted to see as presidents as role models, at least, even if I disagreed with them on politics, modeling what it meant to be a man of integrity. And, one of the things I really appreciated about Barack Obama, I disagreed with him on a number of political matters, but I appreciated that he's a man of character. I appreciated that he's a good husband. He's a good father. He's a person who's characterized by truthfulness. He's a person who he's a serious person, and he's a person of character.
For sure.
And so that formed my political view. So as you can and then Donald Trump comes.
Right.
And you can see how he would be a total mismatch. He's a mismatch on character. Yep. He's isolationist. I like American. I believe in America's military alliances. Yes, he did nominate the justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. But this is really interesting, Adam. He is also the only president since Carter under whom abortions rose. So every president since Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, all had lower abortion rates by the time they left office, to the point where when Obama left office in 2017, abortion rate was lower than it was before Roe. The abortion rate in America was lower. And guess what? Under Trump, the abortion rate rose substantially. Right. And so, I have a lot of my pro-life friends who are saying it's just a total betrayal to turn your back on Donald Trump because he's the only pro-life candidate. And I respond and I say, I get your argument, but it's a lot more complicated than you're making it, because at the end of the 2 terms for Obama, there were 300,000 fewer abortions. 300,000 fewer abortions. At the end of Trump's single term, that momentum had reversed. I can't remember, it's 50 to 70,000 more. but it was tens of thousands more abortions under Trump. And what I tell my pro-life friends is, guys, this is a lot more complicated than just simply nominating justices. And it's much more complicated than even passing laws. And so I, as a pro-life person, my ultimate goal, it's not a victory to overturn Roe and still have the abortion rate really high. The overall goal as a pro-life person is ending abortion, not banning abortion. Those are different concepts, because obviously when abortion was banned in the 70s, it wasn't ended. It was very, very common. And so it's a lot more complicated issue. And so even on that issue, Trump has oversaw a serious pro-life reversal. And then the other thing is, from, again, a pro-life perspective, the pro-life movement has done nothing but lose ever since Trump left office. Something changed in America in its attitude towards the pro-life movement over the last 4 to 6 years. And it's been a very negative change. And I think that is due in large part to the pro-life movement wrapping its arms around a horrible human being.
Yeah.
And I think that causes cognitive dissonance for people. You say you're a compassionate movement who is lifting up the least of these and people who don't have a voice. And to do so, you're wrapping your arms around Donald Trump. I also think, honestly, some of the vaccine conspiracies, that many of them bubbled up from pro-life quarters, that ended up costing hundreds of thousands of American lives, really did undermine part of the pro-life message, as much as the pro-life movement doesn't want to hear that.
Yep.
And so I feel like the Trump era, although a pro-choice person will hear me talk and say, you've lost your mind, this was a disaster for us, Roe was overturned. From my perspective, I look at the state of the pro-life movement and I just see shambles. It's just shambles right now. And I don't have a lot of optimism for the future. And I put a ton of that on its embrace of Trump, on Trump himself, and how Americans justifiably look at a community who says, hey, we support vulnerable people. That's why we're wrapping both our arms around one of the most cruel people ever to inhabit public life. That doesn't match up. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting to unpack. Well, first off, I think that, yes, I think Trump is now cognitive dissonance is a nice word, a nice term, wrapped up in the eradication of Roe, through, I think, many observers of solid convictions of whether you're pro-life or pro-choice know that there was a lot of cynicism to it, knew what it represented. But this, I think a lot of kind of more pragmatic Republican operatives would say they made an uneasy peace with pro-life. People who were really pro-life to fundraise and win votes. Yeah. The actual overturning of it, somebody who's pro-choice, I think was at an absolute earthquake for people to realize that what this would feel like if it went away, especially because of issues of unequal access, and what that meant for poor women and just women's rights in general. And it was sort of like, oh, this will never happen. That would be going backward. And then it happened, but it happened under the guise of somebody so awful as Donald Trump. But
also, it's important to note, in a circumstance where a nomination of Amy Coney Barrett was rushed through at the very end, in circumstances that were more like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg died much closer to the election than Antonin Scalia did in 2016.
Right.
And the Republicans pushed her through. And look, I'm an admirer of Amy Coney Barrett. I think Amy Coney Barrett is an excellent jurist. But from a left-wing perspective, I can easily put myself in the shoes of your Democratic listeners and say, what the heck is going on here? Because here they held the nomination to replace Scalia, and here they're rushing through the nomination to replace Ginsburg. This just looks pure. It's just pure partisan politics. And also, by the way, there many members of the GOP just violated their own statements. After Scalia died, there were senators who said, hey, if there's a vacancy in an election year, we got to wait. We would have that view no matter what. And then it happens, and they turned out not to want to wait. And again, that creates a lot of anger because people know that they've been lied to, and it makes people justifiably angry. And so even though I admire Amy Coney Barrett a great deal, and in fact wanted her to be nominated instead of Kavanaugh in 2018, but even though I admire Amy Coney Barrett a great deal, I was opposed to this rushed through nomination process, because if the standard is going to be we don't nominate and confirm Supreme Court justices in election years, then that should be the rule. Let's apply it even-handedly, right?
Yep. To this point of where the pro-life movement is right now, and I'm speaking politically. What is your response to red states? Right, certainly they're red politically now. Maybe they're obviously not as red about abortion as people might have thought. Be it Kansas, Ohio, Montana,
Kentucky
codifying abortion into law. Kentucky, putting it to the voters and then codifying it to law. What's your take on that? I mean, because they certainly have been supporting mainly pro-life candidates in those states historically at presidential levels, and in the last 15, 20 years, state and local levels. But when this sort of, referenda was put to them, they opted to codify it.
And these are red states too. I mean, again, you went through that list: Montana, Kansas, Ohio, Kentucky. So all the pro-life movement had to do is keep together, not even all, but just keep together the vast majority of its normal political alliance in these states to win, and they couldn't do it. And so there's, I think, a couple of things going on at once here, or several things going on at once. It's complicated. So here's number one.
Yep.
Pro-life identification for a long time has sort of been a shorthand way of saying I'm a Republican. And what people often mean by pro-life isn't necessarily that there should be no abortion. But what they often might mean by being pro-life is they mean it should be more restricted than it is. So somebody would call themselves pro-life if they're for a 15-week ban, even though a 15-week ban doesn't impact 95% of abortions are not impacted by 15-week ban, or sometimes, maybe even a greater percentage. But because that's more conservative than Roe, they'd have called themselves pro-life. And so a lot of people were, when they said pro-life, they just meant more conservative than Roe. And then the other thing that happened was the pro-life movement. Well, let me be more precise. The Republican Party had not given sufficient thought to what the post-Roe world should look like.
No, and that's what I think that's the what's the word? The sticker shock of everything, you know? Yeah.
So first, pro-life Republicans aren't as pro-life as people thought. Second, the GOP, immediately following the repeal of Roe, a lot of the news was how restrictive and punitive can we be? And so, you began to have bills batted around like women should be imprisoned. And then some of these pro-life laws that surfaced and became enforceable once Roe was overturned, people realized they were poorly drafted. Like, these laws were not well drafted laws. And so you have people are not as pro-life as we thought. Number two, you have a lot of Republican incompetence and sometimes outright malice.
Yes.
And then the final element here, which really has really impacted the debate a lot. Let's move to the Alabama IVF ruling.
Yeah.
So what that demonstrated is the pro-life movement is in the GOP is deeply confused philosophically on this, because if your position is life begins at conception and that life is of equal worth to, say, a 2-year-old or a 10-year-old or an 8-week-old or whatever, then the destruction of the frozen embryos is not pro-life. Okay. But you have all of these pro-life IVF families out there, right? And they're thinking, no, this is pro-life to the core because we want to create life. Like, we're doing all of this to have kids. And so, but connecting this idea of the unborn child in a woman's womb, say a young single mom who doesn't have any money and all of this, a pro-life person has said, no, they should carry that to preserve life. But an awful lot of pro-life families, when they've had one child or 2 children or 3 children through IVF, and they have 8, 9, 10 embryos out there, they don't think of that in any way, shape, or form as ending a life when those embryos are not implanted, or when, say, they're put on ice permanently. And so there isn't this sort of philosophical consistency.
Mhm.
And then if there is a philosophical consistency, it then becomes even less popular.
Right.
So then you had the, Mike Johnson and saying, hey, we support IVF. You have the Alabama legislature, we support IVF. And then you get to this point, well, wait a minute, guys. What is it? Is it that these children, like these unborn, very young embryos, these super, super young embryos, are they life or are they not? And are they life if they're in the womb, and not life if they're outside of the womb? It's a mess. It's a mess. And so you see that combination of all of those factors together, and the pro-life movement is really reeling right now. It's just and the GOP as a pro-life party is just really reeling. There was a very smart piece in the Free Press recently, the Barry Weiss outlet, that talked about how the pro-life movement has become kind of the defund the police of the GOP. That
right. Yeah,
that
it's a real albatross. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and for me, this grieves me. Like I was pro-life. I mean, the first concrete pro-life policy I tried to advance was my junior year of college.
Wow.
Where I tried to get my Christian college to remove a policy that punished unwed mothers, because I said that incentivized abortion to conceal pregnancies, to end pregnancies, to conceal, premarital sex. And I said, that's not pro-life. We should warmly embrace pro-life. I mean, warmly embrace single moms at this institution. And
right.
So I'm pro-life from way back, and to see the sort of the collapse of its ability to influence the public here in these last few years is really grievous to me.
Well, I also think it's a case, David, where you came at your position, as a good faith actor from a belief system, and from a non-political point of view, and you ended up working in politics and seeing it differently, and that's, reality biting, I guess. But there's also the issue of the GOP at war with itself, right? Where you have a sort of what has always appealed to me about the best of at least the old school, not the current Republican Party, which believes imposing its will on everybody, but was the idea that there was a sort of libertarian, limited conservative streak in it, and free markets and social tolerance and leave us alone and that kind of thing. But that always brushed up against, I think, 40 to 50 years of the evangelical movement, broadly speaking, again, coming in and wanting to have a Christian thread running through things. And that's always been, I think, a very noxious mix, and I think that's what's left Republicans confused, who don't die on this hill, and many who are good faith believers too, because it's always been something of an uneasy home, because the Democrats have been so much more pro-choice, though Joe Biden was a pretty pro-life Catholic, at least at the beginning of his career. But anyway, I think there's been that tension, that ongoing tension.
There's no question there's a tension. I mean, there's just no question about that. And the tension is just getting worse. And now I'll go back to the IVF situation, because at the end of the day, what we're going to end up with IVF is, hey, if you're a pretty wealthy upper middle class person, hey, we love IVF, and you can spend the money to have IVF, and look, if there's discarded embryos, there's discarded embryos. And then you turn around and tell to the poor 17-year-old, well, that unborn, we need more cats in podcasts.
Yeah, no, we can leave him. That's Ernie. He appears, but anyway.
Yeah. So is it not a life for the 38-year-old lawyer who's got 5 or 6 embryos that have not been implanted, but it is a life for the 17-year-old who's on food stamps? I mean, so that's what I say when you begin to have sort of a philosophical mess, and then one that's then made even more of a mess by politics. then, your movement's in real trouble. And I got a lot of flack because in 2016, I said Donald Trump's going to be bad for the pro-life movement. And then when Dobbs was overturned, people were just, online dunking on me all over the place about that. And my position was just wait. And here we are in 2024. And
well, but it goes back to something that you talked about earlier, which I think is a very important distinction. I want to reemphasize it. It's not about banning abortions. It's about ending them. And that's a good faith point of view you come at. Again, remember, certainly MAGA is the height of maliciousness and the height of viciousness. So take a lot of the bad faith actors who were there for a long time who are happy to throw their lot in with Trump, and then many new people. For sure. And you don't have they're dunking on you because they're looking at it from an incredibly downbeat point of view. Meaning, but in other words, celebrating this, but also not realizing the long-term consequences from a policy standpoint and the people it hurts. The attacks on single moms, the abortion debate always goes into this. And it's always okay, hey, you want all these babies to come into the earth, many who, probably would be born into difficult circumstances. You've got to have some level of safety net and compassion for that too. You know what I mean? And that's been a fair criticism of the right. It's well, you want to cut every program, but you want all these kids to be born. Hey, something's got to give.
You're exactly right. So I'll give you a great example of what's frustrating to me. So Mitt Romney proposed a child allowance program, very similar, but actually in some ways more generous than the one the Biden administration.
You mean the child tax credit that Biden did?
Yeah. So the Biden child tax credit, Mitt had a proposal before the Biden tax credit that was for what he called a child allowance. So in other words, if you're a family member, you would get, if you're a mother and you have a kid at home, you're going to get $300 a month. And Mitt, being Mitt, he made this revenue neutral because he's a businessman. He knows how to make things revenue neutral. So he cut some tax benefits for wealthy people, put that into his proposal, and to allow families to get a child allowance. And what was really critical about the Romney child allowance plan, it began prenatally, so that even about 4 or 5 months before you give birth, you would start to get some money from the government to help you get ready, to buy the diapers, to buy the crib, to just get yourself on a better footing. And one of the things that we found is that a principal driver of the abortion rate is financial insecurity. And so if you can make people more financially secure, the idea is you can actually lower the abortion rate. And there was a demographer who did a study, and he found that the Romney plan could save up to, prevent tens of thousands of abortions. And it was revenue neutral. And yet the Republican Party just kind of dismissed it out of hand. No to this. And, part of it was just pure animosity to Mitt Romney. They don't like him because of what he did to vote for impeachment of Donald Trump, to vote to convict Donald Trump twice. And so, I talked to friends of mine on the left who are very much pro-choice and who would never agree to an abortion restriction, but I can talk to them and we can easily agree to some things, some programs and some policies that I think would reduce the abortion rate by providing support for unwed moms, providing support for struggling families. And, I get a lot of agreement with my progressive friends on that. And so one of my views on the pro-life movement is let's hit the reset button by starting from points of agreement and moving from there.
Yeah. And I think, well, listen, I think finding that common ground is good. I think the worry too is the clash of, you might call it kind of soft Christian nationalism and old-fashioned libertarianism. Okay, overturn Roe, send it back to the states. But then again, as soon as we have an opportunity, we're going to have a federal abortion ban. Well, first of all, I don't think the government should be in this business anyway because of my views. But now you're telling me that you have a sort of 10th Amendment view of things, right? And the states can just have the latitude to do what they want. But now you're going to federalize a prohibition. I mean, it's and again, all this stuff seems to be vengeful to me. It seems to be, and also politically disastrous for them. I don't know who they think who's going to support. It's not going to do them any good. I think they got really hurt, the GOP really hurt in 2022, not just by election denialism, but by women who are angry. And I think if Biden gets reelected, it might be abortion that does it, or at least the right to women who want to have a right to an abortion.
Yeah, it's so one thing that I would say about this is you have a situation in which there is only a minority of GOPers who are what I would call consistently pro-life.
Right.
You have a bigger number of people who, yeah, they're pro-life, but it's down the line on the priority scale, really. But I will tell you this: it is the number one way in which Christian Trump supporters try to bully Christian dissenters into voting for Trump.
Oh yeah.
And that's the number one way. You're a baby killer if you don't want to vote for Trump.
Right. Thrice married with a porn star, probably paid for multiple abortions, but he's your guy. Right.
Right. And so they will tell you you're a baby killer. You don't care about unborn children, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem that they have with that argument is, again, going back to abortion went up under Donald Trump. It went up.
Okay. And by the way, why did it go up and why did it go so down under those? Do we know the data? Do we?
So this is a very interesting question. And as with many complex social phenomenon, there is not one cause.
Okay.
So you couldn't say it's because of Donald Trump that he's the monocausal factor here. But there's an interesting thing that happened, Adam. If you zoom out, during the years that Donald Trump was president, virtually every single marker that indicates hope for the future declined. Okay, so lower marriage rates. Higher murder rates. I mean, murder went way up under Donald Trump. You had a higher deaths of despair at the end of his presidency, and then a higher abortion. You know, what's one of the most hopeful things that you can do in life is bringing a new life into this world. But one of the things I'm really concerned about the era of Trump is it created so much dissension. It created so much conflict. It brought so much pain into the United States of America that a lot of Americans began to just lose hope for the future. Mm-hmm. And you can feel this palpably out there. People don't have hope. I was listening to a British pastor who came to the US, and he said, when you come to the US, that one of the things that absolutely hits you in the face is this sense of anger combined with exhaustion. Mm-hmm. People are angry and they're tired. And this is the legacy of MAGA. I mean, this is the legacy of MAGA. And so until we can turn that corner, you know, we should expect to see continued problems in a lot of these social indicators. And as far as why did it decline before? Yeah, it's very interesting. Some of it is much more widespread contraception. You cannot ignore that at all. Much more widespread contraception. But at the same time, the data indicates more women carried unplanned pregnancies to term than they used to. So a higher percentage of women who had unplanned pregnancies chose to carry their children to term. And that was a part of this decline as well. And this is the thing that goes to sort of this hope for the future, or the sense that you might have enough security. And I also wonder, if you look at the big decline in abortion under Obama, how much did it help that healthcare became more accessible during that time? I've asked myself that question. I wasn't the biggest fan of Obamacare at the time, but I do ask my question, when you see that giant decrease in abortions, how much was something like much greater access to healthcare or universal coverage or near universal coverage? How much did that help? And I don't know the answer to it, but it's certainly, when you see those numbers, it raises the question.
Yeah, no. David, I just want to pivot for a second. And we might have to have David French part 2, because there's a lot of legal stuff I want to talk to you about. But just overview. So I know you were very upset by the 9-0 decision that the court just handed down. But the gestalt of this, you know, is this court capable of, God forbid, there's a Trump 2.0, and are the courts going to prove reliable guardrails, or is the stress test going to be too much? I mean, hard to argue this was a rigged decision, a 9-0. I mean, whether you like it or not, it wasn't some kind of deeply partisan Trump protectorate.
It was, well, okay, so it was 9-0, but it was really 5-4.
Well, right, with the concurrences,
yeah.
you mean?
Yeah. So to really understand what bothered me about the decision, it wasn't the 9-0 part, it was the 5-4 part. Okay, so the 9-0 part, all the 9-0 part did was say that states can't disqualify a candidate for president. Really, it was like states can't disqualify a candidate for federal office.
Right.
But the court went further than that and said, the only way to disqualify is through passing federal legislation. And I can get on board, although I disagree, I can get on board with an idea that says, okay, enforcement of Section 3 cannot come through the states. It has to come through federal processes.
Enforcement of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Of the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
I cannot get on board with the idea that says that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment cannot be enforced until there is enabling legislation.
Okay.
And that turns the text on its head.
Okay.
So let me Section 3, and a lot of people got mad at me because I wrote a piece with a title that the Supreme Court erased part of the Constitution.
Right.
When they said, "What do you mean?" Here's what I mean. Section 3 says, no person shall be a senator, representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, who, having previously taken an oath, engages in insurrection or rebellion. So the key words there, no person shall be. That is an absolute prohibition that Congress can remove by a 2/3 vote. As a result of the Supreme Court decision here, that phrase, no person shall be, is not operative at all unless Congress passes a law. And that stands the Constitution on its head. Because
it's almost like a weird, would you say this is kind of like it's almost like a legislative supremacy in a weird way that overtakes an amendment's very clear aim?
Yeah. So there's this fun meme that's developing from the office space where you've got the consultants and you've got that, I don't know, did you ever see the movie, The Guy with the Red Stapler?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure.
So here you have the consultants. It says, so what do you do here? And Section 3 says, I keep insurrectionists from holding office. It says, wait, you actually keep them out of office? And then it says, I would if Congress let me. And then it says, wait, I got to ask, why didn't Congress just pass a law instead of going through the trouble of amending the Constitution if all that it needed was a statute? What a constitutional provision is superior to a statute. And here, what the Supreme Court said is this constitutional provision cannot even have any force and effect until there's a statute. And that turns things on its head. And I thought that was a real problem. And the dissenting justices or the concurring justices saw that clearly as well. Yeah.
Do you believe the question of immunity or the decision of immunity will be resolved in Trump's favor or not?
Oh, he's losing that.
I would hope so. Okay.
Yeah, he's losing that. I mean, he is losing that. I am very interested to see the timing. I'm much more interested in the timing of the decision than the outcome. But I think his argument is frivolous. There are non-frivolous arguments about official acts and criminal law, but his argument is frivolous.
And are you worried about the timing? I know they're going to hear
extremely.
Yeah, April 23rd or something. They said
25th.
25th toward the end of their session or their docket, or their term, I should say. So you are explain that.
Yeah. So, ordinarily a political calendar is irrelevant to a criminal case, and it should be irrelevant because what does an election have to do with your guilt or innocence? Nothing.
Right.
There is one, but the difference in this case and all other cases involving politicians is if Trump wins, he can end the case.
Right.
And so there is a public interest in the rule of law that says that a criminal claim should be adjudicated on the merits, unless there is a constitutional defect in the criminal claim. There's no constitutional defect in the criminal claim. Therefore, this case should be adjudicated on the merits. But if he wins, It won't be. It won't be. And so my position as a court should take into consideration when it's looking at the calendar. And if there's if there's a circumstance where a trial in July means we can determine the outcome of this case on the merits, but setting it for February means there's, say, a 50-50 chance you won't even be able to hear it at all. The interests of justice dictate that you should go for July unless there is some real prejudice to the defense in going with July, which I don't think is the case at all.
Right. Yeah. Well, David, there's so much to talk about. I love that we could do a wide-ranging conversation on everything from abortion to the conservative movement, or what's left of it. Obviously, here we are before you go in March. So we've got about 8 months of hell here. And, I was talking about this with Steve Schmidt. This is such a precipice. It's so precarious because Biden is by no means a strong incumbent. I'm behind him 100%. It's Biden or bust. It's America or Trump. You can't have both. But boy, I mean, the Democrats insisted on this, and Biden didn't step aside. And I think almost any Democrat, not Kamala, but many a Democrat could have been a younger Democrat would have been his formidable opponent, probably would have sealed Trump's fate pretty early on. But here we are. Are you pessimistic? Are you dour?
I'm not outright pessimistic, but I'm very concerned. Okay. I feel like, look, one of the things, and this is one of the things that is very frustrating to me about the public conversation about age.
Okay.
I grant fully that Trump is old also.
Right.
So, but I'm trying to beat Trump. I want Trump to lose. But
crazy reads as vivacity. I've said this many times.
That is true.
Unfortunately, 77-year-old lunatic can somehow seem incredible to have a spring in his step, though I hate to say it.
I have known older folks who their sort of sunsetting looks more like manic turn, right? And then there are other folks that their sunsetting looks very, very different. And the problem you have is this day for both of these men is, may well be the best day they have compared to every other day that follows. And we, all of us have experience with family members, people we love who reach a point in which there's kind of no coming back. And this sort of idea that if I yell at people long enough on social media for being concerned about age, that they'll stop being concerned about age it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I also think this is getting a little technical. There's a difference between age and senescence. I mean, in the sense of senescence plays itself out in different ways for different people. There's people who are in their early 60s who start to look much older because of wrinkling. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then there's people who remain, again, very vibrant looking. And it's hard to, that's something that's just a natural process. And, Biden, God bless him, looks frail and shuffles and has an old man's gait. It doesn't mean old men shouldn't live in America. Nobody's saying that. It just means that this is the most important job in the world with the highest stress and the highest level of responsibility. Arguably, it's just not a lazy afternoon in the park.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people are disillusioned because on the one hand, you say, okay, Trump is a real threat. He's a huge threat. We have to stop Trump. So therefore, we need to put up our absolute best candidate to stop Trump, the person with the greatest chance.
Right.
And it is not Joe Biden. It's not Joe Biden. And look, I think Joe Biden can win. I think that, if push comes to shove, I'm going to say there's maybe a slightly greater than 50% chance he wins.
Yeah.
But I'm incredibly concerned. And look, if you're yelling at me for being concerned, I'm not the problem here. I'm not the problem here.
Right. Everybody lay off David French, please. Yeah. No, listen, they yell at me. They yell at me too, even when I say endorse him. I mean, again, I'm with Liz Cheney. We can live through bad policies. I don't think all his policies are bad, but we just can't live through 2.0. And that's how I view it. Because we're not, we've right now forfeited the luxury as a country in having this rematch. And because of the direction of of the Republican Party, or what it's become, that we've forfeited the ability to have a tax debate, or what seems so quaint now, policy debates about the size of government. I mean, it just seems almost irrelevant. Also, MAGA believes in big government for what they want. So the whole thing has become blown apart to smithereens, incoherent, inconsistent, but very dangerous. That being said, David, I really appreciate your insight. Our show is built on nuance, and I really appreciate having a conversation with you. I learned a lot today in teasing out some of the nuances of what it means to be pro-life in America. So thank you for that. And for your insight on all things politics.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Adam. I enjoyed the conversation. I didn't expect that I apologize if I took us too long down the pro-life rabbit hole, but it's fascinating, and it's actually a really interesting aspect of our cultural division that often isn't what it looks like from the outside.
It isn't. We haven't, to be fair, this may betray my own pro-choice position, but we haven't had eloquent people on who can articulate a pro-life position. We haven't booked any fire breathers. I just didn't want to do that. But somebody who can come on and, somebody that can come on and lay it out cogently and with intelligence is much appreciated. David, you're now a friend of the show. Don't leave, because I'm going to see you on the other side. But folks, David French of the New York Times. David, where can people email you? I know you let readers contact you.
Yeah. So, my email's public, david.french@nytimes.com.
And are you on Twitter? I don't remember. Do you?
I am on Threads. I maintain my Twitter account just so that nobody can take it over.
Right.
But I post on Threads, David French Jag.
David French Jag. Okay. Well, folks, this was my conversation with David French. David, thank you so much. And folks, again, biggest election of our lifetimes coming up. So, we always tell you, get involved, vote and vote often. In the meantime, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.